This podcast is sponsored by the Fargo-Moorhead West Fargo Chamber of Commerce, announcing the return of the Midwest Economic Outlook Summit February 8th in partnership with 25 co-hosting chambers and communities across 5 states. The summit will bring together industry leaders, policymakers, and economic experts from across the nation to discuss pressing issues facing the Midwest region and country. Learn more at fmwfchamber.com.
Hello there, everyone, and thanks for listening in to another edition of the In-Forum Business Beat podcast. As always, this is your host, Thomas Avanella. Today on the show, we're going to be diving into a topic which has become quite prominent in our newsroom in recent months. You very likely noticed that the inimitable In-Forum reporter Tammy Swift has had a recent string of small-town business success stories. From rural Minnesota's teenage mug girl to the revitalized Hannaford Mercantile Company in North Dakota, it really feels like many businesses are finding a way to thrive in small towns. Over the decades, we've heard an ongoing and persistent narrative that small towns are suffering. So how are these towns and the entrepreneurs that call them home surviving? Tammy is with me today to discuss it all. Tammy, welcome back to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Great. It's great to be back.
And you mentioned it right there. If it feels like it's been a while since you've been on this podcast, it's because it has been. I took a look back this morning. It's been over 2 months. Over 2 months by the time this goes online. It'll have been over 2 months since you've been on here. So how does it feel to be back?
What have I done wrong, Thomas?
You know, we had some holidays in there. It was
I know.
It was a busy time, but we're glad to have you no less.
I'm glad to be back. It's always fun.
And Tammy, obviously, like I said, we're here to discuss the small town success stories you've had recently. And I mentioned a few of them right off the bat, but tell us a little bit more about some of the small towns you visited recently and the business success stories that you found there.
Sure thing. Well, I think the one that first comes to mind is I've recently spent some time in Norman County in northwestern Minnesota, and I found a lot of people there who are working hard to keep their communities going. 2 of those communities, both H names, so you mustn't mess them up because I do sometimes, Hendrum and Hallstad. And I met with their different city officials, and both of those towns actually have some similarities in size, and they've also been affected by the closing of their school buildings. So they now have these huge structures, which they still have to maintain and also find a use for. And I was struck by how they've sort of found some clever ways to use these spaces. For instance, in Hendrum, the cafeteria and school kitchen are now being leased to a local woman for her business, Sugar Mama Bakery. And the school building also turned out to become the ideal temporary headquarters for a local electrical cooperative because they needed a transitional office while in the process of completing a new office building. And then in Hallstad, they've leased their shop area to a sheet metal workers union where they're training apprentices to become sheet metal workers. And the city officials also are collecting RFPs from other small businesses who might want to set up shop in that building. They'd love to see it become a sort of incubator. So really interesting stuff.
And you kind of hit on what seems to be a common theme with these stories, and that's like creative reuse of buildings. You had another one in another H-named town, Hannaford, North Dakota. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, what's with the H names? Isn't that crazy? So there was a retired juvenile probation officer, and he had always admired this 1906 building in Hannaford, and he had run a business before. He'd run a restaurant before, and so he and his son-in-law decided to buy it, and it needed a lot of work, but they fixed it up, and it became the Hannaford Mercantile. And so now it's like this really nice event center and weekend restaurant for people who live all around that area. And it's been really successful. So it's just a beautiful building. I would recommend anybody check it out. And it was just cool to meet him and to hear his passion for the business. And so it was just a neat project to see succeed.
And so as you were reporting on all of these stories, I feel like I think there's an effect here where you hear about one small town and you hear about a second one and a third one, and all of a sudden you're picking up a lot of these. But what really stood out to you most as you're visiting these towns and seeing their successes?
Well, I think one thing is just the creativity to reuse old buildings, especially like with these school buildings. Some of them are as big as 60,000 square feet. I mean, they're huge, and they are just sitting there. And so I love the idea that people are thinking, oh, I'm not just going to put up a steel building. But maybe we could actually reuse something that's already there. And so I think both Hendrum and Hallstatt are thinking that way very much so. So did the people behind the Mercantile. And, it also brings me way back to that Nome School project, which was a very dilapidated old building and which has been turned into a fiber arts center and kind of a B&B and event center and all these different things. So I think that's probably the most interesting thing is, at a time when construction costs are so great, it might actually just make more sense to renovate what you have.
And on the entrepreneurial side of things here, as far as the businesses go, what are some of the common themes that you've identified that seem to have emerged while you've been working on these stories?
Well, I think it seemed like most of these people did not seem to have trouble attracting clients at all or customers. They make plenty of money doing what they're doing. But the biggest thing for them is attracting staff. I'm thinking one of the women I talked to in Hallstatt is a master hair colorist, and she actually had done all kinds of training for the Aveda Institute and had lived all over the country and had some very impressive credentials. She ran she ran businesses that had like 50 employees. And then what did she do? She decided to move back to Hallstatt, her hometown. And she is so busy. She has more work and more appointments than she knows what to do with, but she can't find another stylist to come and work there. And she could easily keep that stylist busy. So I think the big thing that I sort of heard over and over again was just staffing concerns. There just isn't a very big labor pool to draw from.
And we hear about that here in Fargo-Moorhead all the time. So
yeah,
extrapolate that for a small town. I mean, I have to imagine that's 10, 20 times worse than what people here in Fargo feel.
Exactly. And that brings up another thing, again, talking about the buildings. You could lease a building for so cheaply in a town like that. And the city officials would be so happy to have you. They'd probably bend over backwards to help you set up and get every advantage out of it. But again, it's the location thing. Most people don't think twice about driving probably from Hallstatt to Fargo to work. But how many people are going to drive from Fargo to Hallstatt to work? It would be hard for some different business owners, I think, to broaden their thinking and realize, hey, I could put up headquarters in Hallstatt for the fraction of what it would be in a bigger city.
And so kind of just to offer a peek behind the curtain here, we do a lot of tracking of web analytics here at the Forum, in the Forum newsroom. And so one of the things that we've noticed is that all of these small town stories are extremely popular with readers. Why do you feel like these stories seem to resonate so much with people?
I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think the one is just people love to hear success stories. They love to hear of someone who did something unusual and creative and, revitalized a small town or just really made a difference. So I think that's one reason. It's their feel-good stories. I think another reason is because so many of us, especially in this area, came from small towns. And so we have all been through the same struggles that these towns have been. Many of us, my own small town in Western North Dakota, lost its restaurant, and that was a huge deal. Suddenly found that it needed to consolidate with other schools in order to participate in sports, has seen its class sizes shrinking. So many people can relate to that. And so I think that is one reason it resonates. It bothers us. We don't want to see that Mayberry lifestyle, as we like to think of it, go away. And so I think that's what it is. I mean, there are definite challenges to living in a small town, but there's a lot of good to be said about it as well. And so people just don't want that to go away.
And across all of these stories, what do you feel like were the takeaways for you as you were out reporting on them, or for our audience? What did you learn in this process, and what do you think other small towns can take from this?
Well, I think one thing I got out of it is that I think in the past, different communities were very independent and they were sort of looking out for their town. And I think they're starting to realize that they may have to work together to kind of increase marketing funds, increase their talent in order to attract people to a region instead of just a small town. I know they've been talking about that in Norman County to a certain extent. And yeah, I think that makes sense. It's just thinking more community beyond your community. I would say the other thing is one of the Halstead City boosters kind of introduced me to this study by a University of Minnesota researcher. And he introduced me to a new word, this researcher. He said, don't rely too much on anecdata, which is information which is presented as if based on serious research, when in fact it's based on something that somebody thinks is true. And the anecdata that he was referring to is this longstanding narrative about the brain drain, the loss of population that is just causing America's small towns to wither and die. He says this is actually a fact that has been greatly exaggerated by the media and others. And he presented a bunch of statistics that show our rural population has actually increased by 11% since 1970, regardless of what we have heard. And he points out that there are actually more households in these rural communities than there were 30, 40 years ago, but they just have fewer children. And a lot more of them are like empty nesters or a single adult. And so actually we are not losing population. Another thing that he pointed out is that so many people want to move back home after they've left their small town. They cite the usual reasons: cheap housing, slower pace of life, safe, low crime. And a lot of these people actually have a lot of talent to bring back. Nearly 70% of them have their bachelor's degrees. Over half of them have children. And so it really would pay to try to attract some of these people to live there. I know you did a story on this, Thomas, on the free lot program in Halstead. I mean, the opportunity to get a free lot to build your home or whatever. I mean, that's a fantastic head start. That was interesting to me. The thought that, wow, maybe things aren't as dire as we've painted them. And maybe we just need to get more creative about how small towns operate. And one thing that also came out of this research was that small towns have to work at not only reaching out and attracting people, but also welcoming them once they come in. And I know, coming from a small town myself, that's not always easy. Sometimes newcomers are eyed rather warily, but they just point out how important that fresh, new perspective is, and how these people can bring new talent and new ideas. And so we mustn't forget that.
So what you're telling me is, let's not really call this a comeback then. They never really went out of style, did they?
They probably didn't. I mean, I think things changed, certainly. Like, people started going to a larger city to shop at Walmart, and that certainly did hurt the smaller town Main Street. But I don't think it's insurmountable. I think as long as there are dedicated leaders and creative thinking, there's room for everyone. Everyone can succeed.
And that was Inforum reporter Tammy Swift with me to discuss some of her recent reporting on small town businesses and how they're finding ways to succeed. You can find all of Tammy's stories on inforum.com/Tammy-Swift. So Tammy, once again, thanks for being here today. Thanks for making a comeback to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks, Thomas.
And once again, I want to thank reporter Tammy Swift for making some time to rejoin us here on the podcast. That's going to wrap up this week's episode, but be sure to tune in again soon for all the latest from the Inforum business team. Until then, visit inforum.com/business to stay up to date.
Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month. You'll get unlimited access to the news you need to stay engaged and connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe now to get 3 months of local news for only 99 cents a month.
Don't you hate when you forget something important? Grandma's birthday, the password to your old laptop, or picking up little Timmy from hockey practice? It's okay, we've all been there. Let us take one thing off your mind this year with Giving Hearts Day scheduled giving. Starting January 2nd, you can give to one of hundreds of charitable causes before the big day. You can even pledge to volunteer if that's your thing. Visit givingheartsday.org and help someone in your community today.